Well, thank you so much, Laurie. We're really lucky to get Laurie Carter Noble to speak to us. She's a lecturer and a writer, and she's currently working on a biography of Olympia Brown. For 20 years, she's given lectures on the American women's suffrage movement, as well as church services on the pioneering work of Olympia Brown in the UU Church as a minister. And I forget what state that was, Iowa or someplace out west. Anyway, today she's going to talk about three very unusual women who got to work together. Olympia Brown, Isabella Beecher Hooker, and Victoria Woodfall. And I've read some of Laurie's articles and some information she sent, and she really has a lot of information. So I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions too. Thank you. And
thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for asking me to come. I'm so pleased to be here. And I want to thank Patricia for all her help and Mark as well, because without the two of them, this would not have come off as seamlessly as I hope it will. And I so appreciate the Alliance for asking me to be here as well. So I want to let you know that the talk will be informal. So if you have questions, just go ahead and ask, and I'm going to try to have a lot of time at the end for them. And because it's three women and it's hard to focus on all three, what my emphasis today is going to be basically on the friendship between Isabella Beecher Hooker and Olympia Brown, because that is an extraordinary relationship. And to any of you who are interested in this area, the letters of Olympia Brown, all of her papers, are at the Cambridge Institute. It was the Radcliffe Institute. It's now the Schlesinger Library for feminist research. And her papers are accessible. If you go, you can make an appointment, and you see all of these letters from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and you understand the significance of letters, because the personalities of the writer comes through so clearly. And Isabella Beecher Hooker's letters are at the Stowe Center in Hartford, and those are also accessible. And that's where I did some of my research. And I'll read a couple of excerpts from the letters between Olympia and Isabella, because they are very poignant. And so I hope that you will find the stories of these three women as fascinating as I did. And I just want to let you know how I became interested in Olympia Brown in the late 1980s. There was a message in the UU world that anybody interested in women's history, and in UU women's history specifically, could come to a weekend retreat, because they were researching the possibility of an anthology. And I thought, oh, well, that'll be nice. I was living in Hingham at the time, and the retreat was in Duxbury, so that was easy. And it was such a wonderful experience, because within a weekend, we created the framework for an anthology about Unitarian Universalist women and social reform, and how influential they have been. And we each were to take two women and use her examples of her writing and write a short biographical sketch. So I took Abigail Adams, because I knew something about her, and then I couldn't find another woman, and I was looking in the bookcase, and I said, oh, who's Olympia Brown? And the lead editor said, oh, Laurie, Olympia Brown, that's the next woman you're going to write about. And I have been writing about her and talking about her ever since. And the book is available still at the UU bookstore. It's called Standing Before Us, Unitarian Universalist Women and Social Reform from 1776 to 1936. The lead editor is Dorothy Emerson, and
Hmm.
my selection inside.
Jump in. Do you know that Dorothy Emerson was at the first church?
A long time ago. Yeah, yeah, very long time ago.
Yeah,
Uh,
she
and,
just died recently, Dorothy
oh,
Emerson.
oh,
Yeah,
that's,
yeah, she's an
so,
amazing woman.
yes, yeah. Well, her lead on this was really incredible.
I
And
can imagine.
in a weekend, we got the entire thing laid out, and then, of course, we all had to have our entries, etc. So this is my entry on Olympia Brown, and it uses one of her talks and one of her most influential articles on the higher education of women, which is so prescient today. And I was able, because it's not that long, I was able to use the entire thing. Some of the articles and talks we had to excerpt, but that is in its entirety. And so I have just been so grateful to Dorothy for being the lead, uh, getting the fellowship to fund our weekend, and then making this book happen. It was a huge achievement on everyone's part, but hers particularly. So um, that's maybe this talk will be in honor of her. The friendship of Isabella Beecher Hooker and Olympia Brown, as reflected in their letters, is meaningful and inspiring and kind of an interesting perspective on women who confront the power structure of the time and how that influences their lives and informs who they become, and for sometimes better and sometimes worse. Olympia Brown was one of the first women ordained to the ministry in America. There's the controversy because there were others that had been ordained by a congregation, but she was ordained by the Universalist denomination, and she was also the first woman to graduate from a Universalist divinity school at St. Lawrence University. Both Isabella and Olympia worked indefatigably for women's rights throughout their lives, not only as dedicated and capable workers in the American women's suffrage movement, but in the fields of education and professional opportunities for women. I'd like to start with Isabella Beecher Hooker. She lived from 1822 to 1907. She was the half sister, um, for better or for worse, I might add, of Catherine Beecher, who never married but was a supposed expert on domestic achievement and pioneered the science of home economics. All her other half sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and her half brother was the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. Henry Ward Beecher was a very prominent minister at the Brooklyn, New York Congregational Church. He wrote a very uh, influential and best-selling book called The Life of Christ. And his other book, interestingly enough, was called The Gospel of Love. And there's a story there, as you will find out. Isabella Beecher Hooker was a skilled organizer of the women's suffrage movement and was also um, an advocate of a broad range of reforms for women in the area of divorce, health, and property rights. Under a gentle exterior, she had a resolve of steel. In one of the most painful chapters of her life, she stood for the right as she saw it and never retreated, not one single inch. Diplomatic, ingratiating, compassionate and insightful. She could also be intransigent in promoting her causes. A firm believer in spiritualism, she persisted in communing with her spirits even after she was made the object of ridicule by her family. Because of an open and trusting nature, she was sometimes easily deceived and occasionally defenseless in the face of cruelty and duplicity. And we'll find that with her relationship with Victoria Woodhull on the one hand, and with her very prominent family on the other. The Beechers were one of the, Brahmin families, so-called, of Hartford, and had tremendous amounts of social status at the time. Olympia Brown lived from 1835 to 1928. She was the first woman to graduate from the theological school at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and in 1863, she was ordained by full denominational authority. She was a Universalist minister and served parishes in Weymouth, Massachusetts, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and finally Racine, Wisconsin. After leaving full-time ministry in 1886 to devote more time to working for women's suffrage, Olympia helped out rural congregations in Wisconsin by serving as a part-time minister. A woman of small stature with a thin, high-pitched voice, which made her the butt of many jokes by her male divinity school counterparts, she took elocution lessons, rigorously completed a set of prescribed exercises for voice development, and practiced relentlessly. This is a part of her letters, and it's one of the most lovely experiences in looking at these letters.
We
Because,
can't see the slides right now. I can't.
oh, um, Olympia Brown, that's Olympia when she was young. That's probably when she was in divinity school. And the next slide will be, I think, her divinity school. Yeah, that's New York St. Lawrence University, and it was there. The Universalist divinity schools had at their mission allowing women to study, but when she applied, she was turned down by all of them except for St. Lawrence, where the president wrote her kind of a discouraging letter, but he didn't tell her she couldn't come. So she was living in Michigan at the time, and she packed her bags and and went by boat and carriage and various other conveyances to St. Lawrence and appeared at his door. And he had no idea who she was. And she introduced herself. And he said, "But I wrote you a letter." She said, "Yes, I understand. I have it." And he said, "Yes, but I was," she said, "Well, I'm here to enroll in divinity school." And he said, "But didn't you see that my letter was so discouraging?" And she said, "Oh, well, your discouragement was my encouragement.
Oh,
So I'm here." And he, so to his great credit, he decided, well, here she is. Now what do I do? I guess she'll be enrolled in the divinity school. He couldn't possibly send this little person back to Michigan, and being really the decent person he was, he allowed her to enroll. The divinity school experience was especially painful because of her voice. She was tiny, she was only 5 feet tall, and she had this really high pitched, thin voice. And so the the students, all of whom were men at the time, made fun of her and stood under her dorm window and kind of read sermons in this high-pitched, squeaky voice. And she decided that, okay, she was fine with being a woman, and she was okay with being small. but even if she weren't, those were not anything she could do something about, but she could do something about her voice. So she found a speech teacher who ended up being a very famous speech teacher here in Massachusetts. And he gave her elocution lessons and he gave her exercises. And the exercises consisted of building up her chest capacity with these it looked like bowling pins, these very heavy um, pins that she would grab hold of and then swing in various configurations every single day so that she would, exercise these muscles and be able to project her voice, which she ultimately was able to do. And in the suffrage movement, of course, there were no microphones and there were a lot of rowdies at many of her talks, and she was able to talk over them. She was just remarkable. And in her letters, there's this one place where she loves her garden in Wisconsin, and even toward the end of her career, she was still practicing her voice projection. So she would write her sermons, and then she'd go out to her garden and start declaiming to the tulips and the daffodils and whatever other flowers there were, and convince them about the glories of universalism. And I just think that's such a wonderful image of who she was and how positive and how persevering and how strong-willed she was, and how ultimately, in spite of a lot of setbacks, she prevailed. There were also two aspects of the suffrage movement. There was the national suffrage movement and then the American. And the national is the one that Olympia Brown and Isabella were in. Lucy Stone and Henry Ward Beecher were in the other division. The two split apart. That's another story, but that's just later on that will be a significant fact. Her Mark, could we see the next slide for Olympia, please? Yeah. And this is Olympia Brown in her bloomer costume. This was a radical um, development. This Louisa Bloomer decided that women's clothing was way too constrictive. And so if they were going to get exercise and live an active life, they couldn't have petticoats that sometimes weighed 30 pounds, or various other, paraphernalia, corsets, who knows what else, bustles. Many of the fashions also were very restrictive and kept women from from doing things that were healthful, exercise, for instance. So this bloomer costume was created, and the suffragists especially, and other active women too, decided that it was just perfect for what they needed to do. And then it became emblematic of the suffrage movement. And the people who were opposed to the movement used this outfit to ridicule the women. And that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very robust woman. I don't think this outfit was necessarily made with her body type in mind. So, but they decided that they were not going to wear it anymore. But Olympia Brown and some of the other suffragists said, that's it. They're going to make fun of us one way or the other. We're wearing it. And so there she is. That's, I think, when she was at Antioch University. So, and she wore it, until she was older, because it was it didn't require a corset. You weren't dragging, heavy skirts around. They weren't on the floor. It was actually very practical, and why it would be controversial, I have no idea, but that's what happens with image. So then may we have the next slide, please, Mark, for Olympia. This Olympia Brown after her two ministries in one in Weymouth and one in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her final ministry was in Wisconsin. And so she was very active in the western part of the suffrage movement. And interestingly enough, the western states allowed women to vote in local elections way before other states did. The western states were actually quite in the forefront of the suffrage movement. So that's the slide commemorating that. Next, please, Mark. And that's Olympia Brown when she was probably when she was in Racine, Wisconsin, as she was, a more mature minister. She had two children. She had an absolutely wonderful husband who supported her in everything and sadly died of a stroke. And in her letters, the saddest letter is one that starts, "Endless sorrow has fallen on my heart."
Oh,
So,
oh,
the next slide, please. This is at Divinity School. Some of the other women here are the wives or possibly the fiancées of the men, but the circle with Olympia Brown shows her as the only graduating woman from that class. Next, please. And that's Olympia Brown in her later years. Um, her sermons are only able to be reconstructed from her notes because she never wrote her sermons out. She put notes for herself in her hand and then stood in her congregation and talked to the congregation. She wasn't up on a podium. So that's interesting. I think is that the final slide for us, Mark?
Yes.
Okay. After when Olympia Brown had a dual career, one as minister and one as an advocate for women's suffrage, and then when she in her last years, she was also a very active peace advocate, and she was one of the first members of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and that her membership card is in her papers. So Victoria Woodhull lived from 1838 to 1927, and there she is. She was stunningly beautiful, incredibly self-assured, convinced that both destiny and Demosthenes, whom she believed was her guiding spirit, had a leadership role in mind for her. Victoria Woodhull was admired, castigated, sought after, shunned, promoted, and abandoned by her contemporaries, especially those that she worked with in the women's suffrage movement. She and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, were set up in the stockbrokerage business by Cornelius Vanderbilt, becoming the first female stockbrokers. That might have also come about because Tennessee Claflin, Victoria Woodhull's sister, was the mistress of Cornelius Vanderbilt. So that might have accounted for their success in being part of the pioneering women in the stock brokerage business. They were very successful, and the talk at the time was because they were spiritualists. Spiritualism was at the end of the 19th century, it was a very highly regarded movement. Victoria Woodhull was actually the head of the spiritualist movement, and one of the beliefs was that you are guided by two spirits throughout your life. The two spirits that Victoria Woodhull chose were the Josephine, Napoleon's wife, interestingly enough, and then Demosthenes, the Greek historian and philosopher. So the other Mary Todd Lincoln was vilified also for seeking spiritualist guidance. And I can see, when you lose your children or you lose loved ones, it must be tremendously comforting to feel that they're not gone forever, that you can still commune with their spirits. There's less of a separation between our physical lives and our spiritual life, which is the reason for that. I don't know if you're familiar with Waterstone's bookstore when it was in Boston, but it's a very large building on Newbury and Exeter Street. That's now the Montessori School, and that was the headquarters of the lead temple for spiritualism. It was huge. I mean, it was a tremendously influential religious movement at the time. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president of the United States.
Mm.
Later, she, Mark, could you put the next slide? All right, that is about 15 years after the first slide we saw. And this is after the trial, the Beecher Tilton trial that I'll talk about, and you can see the huge effect that had on her. The next slide, please. This is when she ran for president in 1872. She was the first woman to run for president of the United States, and her vice presidential partner was Frederick Lloyd Douglass. So that's an interesting combination. Frank about matters of sex and the object of salacious gossip because of her many liaisons, Victoria flew in the face of the prim and what she deemed totally hypocritical morality of the time, decrying the double standard that permitted men to be promiscuous and insisted on chastity for women. She shocked America by stating that she should be free to love whomever she pleased and to change lovers as often as she pleased. And it was no one's business who she loved, how she loved them, or when she loved them. The scandals that surrounded her personal life tainted the suffrage movement and gave many opponents material with which to discredit the suffrage movement and claim that freedom to vote for women would usher in a host of other freedoms for women, leading to social anarchy and moral decay. And that was one of the things that was, next slide, please. That was one of the things that was particularly a problem for the suffragists. Many, not men, by the way, many women felt that it was a very dangerous movement because if you gave women rights to do things outside of the domestic sphere, the women's sphere so-called, then they would no longer be home raising Christian children and supporting their husbands, and all kinds of issues could come in. Now, Victoria Woodhull also had other ideas. She was a communist. She wanted a more equal distribution of wealth. She was very concerned about workers' rights. And she herself was a very highly paid public speaker. She was beautiful and she spoke eloquently. She was the first woman to present a petition in front of Congress. And when she went on the speaker circuit, she was one of the highest paid speakers at the time. And Gloria Steinem, in her letters, has an anecdote about her. She has a letter from Victoria Woodhull on her bulletin board where Victoria Woodhull was asked to reduce her speaking fee. And she writes back to the person who asked her this, the entrepreneur who asked her to speak. She said, my speaking fee is $300. That is my fee. please let me know within 2 weeks whether you are willing to pay this fee or not, because I have many other possibilities for further speaking engagements. Yours truly, Victoria Woodhull. And Gloria Steinem said, so often women especially are asked to reduce their fees, to speak for nothing, to do this, to do that, to be charitable, to be generous. And so Gloria Steinem is tempted to do that. She looks at the letter from Victoria Woodhull indicating that her fee is $300. Basically, love it or leave it. So what made attacking Victoria Woodhull so productive was the fact that she was completely outspoken and made no effort to ameliorate her views. And so with free love, for instance, it was given the term free love. She didn't give it that term. That's just what she was accused of. And so the idea of women now who were going to start voting being promiscuous, not being, willing to stay home for their husbands, etc., was something that was all connected to her. And the final blow came with this very famous cartoon by Thomas Nast, and Victoria Woodhull is portrayed as a female version of Satan, and the caption is actually Mrs. Satan, and she has a banner proclaiming be saved by free love, which of course she never claimed. And in the background, if you can see the background of this, in the background is a woman with children, and with the husband on her back who's drinking, and that is the other issue with the suffrage movement. One of the reasons the suffrage votes were so rarely successful was because the liquor industry was opposed to suffrage, because they felt that if women got the vote, they would institute temperance, because so often when men were drinking, they would first of all use all of their funds for drinking, and the wife was left at home with the children and no visible means of support. And so the liquor interests actually paid immigrants or anybody to vote against the suffrage amendments, and that was a whole nother series of problems. But so in this case, Victoria Woodhull is connected to two of the most controversial aspects of suffrage. One, that if you have women voting, they're not going to be staying home and taking care of their husbands. And two, if they're going to be voting, they're going to vote for temperance, and the liquor interests will be basically without some of their most profitable customers. So, is that our do we have another slide? Yeah. Now, this is at a later time. This is part of the Beecher Tilton trial, so we will come to that a little bit later. But keep that in mind. In the meantime, Mark, if you could go back to the other, to Vicky, the previous, the one that's her biography. Victoria Woodhull has three biographies, four. One is the woman who would be president. One is Vicky, and one is my favorite, and it's called Notorious Victoria. What these three different women had in common was a passionate commitment to the cause of women's suffrage, women's rights, and the truth as they saw it. Active in the suffrage movement for many years, beginning in the late 1860s, these three women took very different paths. However, in 1872, their paths crossed when Victoria Woodhull made allegations against the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, accusing the eminent minister of adultery with Elizabeth Tilton, one of his parishioners. This expose ultimately led to the sensational Beecher-Tilton trial of 1873. The events surrounding the trial show the price women often had to pay for confronting powerful men and institutions. In the late 19th century as today, when a woman attacked powerful societal, political, economic, or religious forces, efforts were made to personally discredit her and therefore blunt her attack. For daring to confront such centers of power, women were many times ridiculed, dismissed, or destroyed. And we'll see that with Victoria Woodhull in one way. And you can even, American Masters right now has a wonderful program on Anita Hill, and so does the Finding Your Roots. Henry Lee Skip Gates has just done this week a profile of Anita Hill and her ancestors, and she talks about what happened when she testified against this notorious judge at this point, and how vilified she was, how often she was kind of portrayed as either mentally imbalanced or promiscuous herself, or making up or fabricating these stories altogether. And then in the course of her discussions with Henry Lee Gates, she talks about that, about the fact that when right after the hearings, 30% of the people believed her. And she thought, well, 30%, that's 30%. I can deal with that. And so she continued to stand by her testimony through, and thought, 30% is certainly better than 5%. And several years later, it was the number of people who believed her had risen to 70%. And I think that's probably what it is today. Vilified as Mrs. Satan in a vicious cartoon by Thomas Nast, which we've seen, imprisoned for accusing a powerful man of hypocrisy, which was what happened after the Beecher-Tilton trial. Hounded by the aggressive and often hypocritical guardians of virtue in the 1870s, Victoria Woodhull was abandoned by most of the women whose cause of suffrage and equality she had championed. An outspoken advocate of women's right to self-determination in marriage, the workplace, and in politics, Victoria Woodhull had counted among her supporters Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other prominent suffragists. Although Stanton refused to turn her back on Woodhull, many other suffragists, especially Lucy Stone, led the attack on Victoria Woodhull as soon as she made public her accusations that Henry Ward Beecher, the minister of Plymouth Congregational Church in Brookline, was an adulterer. A leading critic of Victoria Woodhull's advocacy of free love, Henry Ward Beecher, was also the president of the New England-dominated American Suffrage Association, which was also supported by Lucy Stone. On November 2nd, 1872, an issue of the Woodhull and Claflin Weekly, the newspaper that Victoria and Tennessee Claflin published in New York, revealed that the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher had been having an affair of long standing with Elizabeth Tilton, one of his parishioners, and the wife of a close friend and advisor, and of one of the key power centers of Plymouth Church, namely the Board of Trustees, theater. It appeared that while Beecher proclaimed his abhorrence of free love in public, he actively practiced it in private. Interestingly enough, the book he wrote was The Life of Christ. The gospel he promoted in his sermons was called the Gospel of Love, interestingly enough. And one of the cartoons, much later, after everything was had settled down, was of the cartoonist illustrated Beecher speaking to at least 25 of his ex-mistresses on any given Sunday. But that was many years after Victoria Wood
So,
had paid the price of coming up against him. With the accusation against the Reverend Beecher, Victoria Woodhull released a firestorm that was ultimately to consume her. It destroyed Victoria Woodhull, the passionate foe of the status quo for women. It silenced Victoria Woodhull, the fierce crusader for women's rights. What emerged after this confrontation was a broken and chastised woman. She left the United States and took up residence in England. There she married a rich man and recreated herself as a respectable upper-class matron, trying as best she could to falsify or obliterate her revolutionary past. The trial resulted in a hung jury, even though there was a lot of evidence against Beecher. It bankrupted Victoria Woodhull. She would have probably gone to jail, except for Cornelius Vanderbilt rescuing her by sending her and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, to England. And both of them in England married rich men. And Victoria Woodhull became the wife of a prominent banker, and henceforth was known as Mrs. John Biddulph. And very little remained of Victoria Woodhull. I think this is such a textbook case of it's very admirable to see the right and work for the right, and it takes a tremendous cost, because in Isabella Beecher Hooker's case, the cost was different. Isabella Beecher Hooker, could we go back to one of the slides of Isabella? Yeah, that one's, thank you. She, as I said, was the half sister. The Beechers stood behind Henry Ward very vociferously. And Isabella looked at some of the evidence and talked to various people. I mean, he was such an adulterer. It was a well-known fact that he had, one affair after another. And Isabella realized that she could not in good conscience support him, because there was just too much evidence that to the contrary. So the Beecher family made it clear that if she did not support him, they would discredit her for her spiritualist views, her talking to spirits and various things, and they would make it clear that she was so mentally unstable that she needed to be put into an insane asylum. And that was a clear and present danger to her. And her husband, who was a prominent lawyer at the time in Hartford, her husband said, we are going to take our family and go to Europe. And fortunately, he had the means to do that. And being a prominent lawyer, he was able to stay in America to make a living up to a point, and then he joined her and the family in exile, and they were in exile in Europe. It was 6 or 7 years before they dared to come back. Uh, and interestingly enough, the suffragists that she had worked for so hard um, uh, didn't bother reaching out to the only one of the only suffragists who stood behind her and supported her was Olympia Brown. They were such close friends that they never Olympia never wavered. Olympia had a lot of reservations about Victoria Woodhull. She just didn't find Victoria Woodhull was necessarily trustworthy. She felt she was a self-promoter. She thought that she was problematic for the suffrage movement because she was so frank about things like free love, and she just did not. Um, you know, Olympia Brown herself was such a different personality that
Mm.
she felt that there was something about Isabella, that's something about Victoria Woodhull, I'm sorry, that was exploitative and that was self-promoting and that was just too um, untrustworthy
Mm.
to support without reservation. And in one of the letters that I want to read to you, you can see how how astute Victoria Woodhull is, and um, how and how concerned she is about her friend Isabella, even though she doesn't. At this point, Isabella had to go to Europe and she was just devastated and so sad. It was such a horrible time for her. And so the last thing Victoria Woodhull wanted to do, I mean, the last thing Olympia wanted to do was to hector Isabella, because she was still an advocate for Victoria Woodhull. So this is what Olympia Brown writes to Isabella on December 8th, 1871. Now, my dear Isabella, um, Isabella, by the way, calls Olympia Brown in the letters Brownie. So, um, my dear Isabella, now with regard to Mrs. Woodhull, far be it from me to attack or persecute her. I will not publicly attack any woman while we are oppressed as now, and any woman who tries to help us with our cause. I will not sit in judgment upon one whose experiences have been so different from mine and whose life has evidently been so uncommon. Well, that's definitely an understatement with Victoria Woodhull.
That's right.
She had a very shady past. She was known by people in my mother's generation as a fast number. She had an irregular domestic arrangement, to say the least, and she was completely um, unafraid to be considered scandalous. So yes, her life definitely was uncommon, no question about that. So then Olympia continues. Um, my dear friend, I honor you for having stood by a woman that you believed to be innocent. I glory in your defiance of a false and wicked public sentiment, which condemned without a hearing, and a mean cowardice, which denounces the truth spoken because of the person speaking it. We could use that today. For your courage in this respect, I shall always hold you in the highest esteem, and I might almost say veneration. But I do not have the confidence in Mrs. Woodhull that I once had. A series of little things, all trifles, but revealing character, make me think that she won't do to tie ourselves to. I mean by that, she's not reliable and you cannot depend upon her. Even now, I don't believe that she's any friend of yours, except so far as she can work upon your enthusiastic nature and make you serve her purpose. I don't propose to have much dealing with her. Let her do her work in her own work. But if I were you, dear friend, I would not go any deeper with Mrs. Woodhull until there's better evidence than there is now of her being trustworthy. And there, I think you see how um, how very astute Olympia Brown is, and how gentle she is, and what a wonderful loyal friend she is. Isabella uh, came back and advocated for women's educational opportunities, for birth control, actually, for women. She was a very big proponent of men being reticent enough sexually to not constantly have women be pregnant. She felt that small families were the only way that women could have a life beyond beyond raising children, and she never felt that she had made a difference. And she made a tremendous difference in so many ways. Victoria Woodhull, as I said, could not sustain being the person she was, and we wonder today just exactly what contribution she might have made, how she would have influenced women's roles moving forward in so many ways. Would she have continued to be an attention getting, financially successful, daring, and dramatic advocate for women's life? What changes in the status quo might she have wrought had she not been silenced? And what difference might she have made? Um, the story of Olympia Brown is actually quite wonderful, because she was honored, first of all, by St. Lawrence University and Unitarian Universalists in 1963, when a plaque was unveiled showing her contributions to the Unitarian Universalist movement, for one, and women for two. And the plaque in her honor says, "Preacher of Universalism, pioneer and champion of women's citizenship rights, forerunner of the new era, may her flame burn and light the way to future generations." Victoria Woodhull, Isabella Beecher Hooker, and Olympia Brown, each in her own way, were all forerunners of a new era. May their flames continue to burn and light the way to future generations. Thank you. And this is the church that Olympia Brown preached in. This was her last full-time ministry. It has been renamed the Olympia Brown Church, and a group of parishioners there, that is their congregation, a group of parishioners got got word of the fact that one of the elementary schools years ago was going to be renamed. And so they, of course, immediately advocated for Olympia Brown, and made her one of the applicants. There were 3 finalists. Olympia Brown was one. She wasn't chosen. And the women in the church got wind of this, and had a huge public relations campaign. They called in every favor. They leaned on every person. They just would not rest until the vote was opened up a second time. And so finally, the town fathers thought that they just couldn't deal with all these people at once, and they said, "Fine, fine, fine. We'll take the vote again." Okay, they took the vote again, and interestingly enough, it was overwhelmingly to name the school the Olympia Brown Elementary School, which it is to this day. So that's, I think, such a hopeful thing. And this final um, quote from her uh, is just so wonderful in light of today. The more we learn of science, the more we see that its wonderful mysteries are all explained by a few simple laws so connected together and so dependent upon each other that we see the same mind animating them all. So now I would love to have you um, give us your perspective and what you'd like to learn more about or what questions you might have.
Laurie, where is the Olympia Brown Church?
Racine, Wisconsin.
Okay.
And they just had a big commemoration for her, I think about a year ago. Mm-hmm. They're very, they're very proud of her, and they, as you could see with the advocating for the school. And I think it's just Olympia Brown was very dedicated to, to children's, not education for sure, but children being a part of the church, an integral part of the church, and every church she went to, that was one of her goals.
Have you been there for any of the occasions at that church honoring her?
No, I've always wanted to go. I was going to go, last year, but then COVID came, and I was so sorry. So I haven't, but I've been in touch with them. They're wonderful people, and it's
I
lovely.
have a question, Laurie. I'm Stephanie Hughes here in the Chicago area. Lovely to see you. This has been just fascinating. Sort of an off the wall question. I gather that at this time, the issues of LGBTQ just were not anywhere on the horizon. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I would think. There's very little evidence that was a concern. I think it was still considered so scandalous that it was underground. Yeah.
Mhm. Although I think Victoria Woodhull probably would have embraced that too.
Oh my goodness. And yes, yeah, she would have been very good to call attention to the AIDS crisis, because the thing about her is that she was totally fearless. She didn't care, and she was so out there. And with the AIDS crisis, I mean, until ACT UP came and they took it to the streets, there was not much happening at all. I think it takes someone who is unafraid to confront a very powerful force.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for coming.
Laurie, the name Claflin rang a bell. And any relationship to the Belmont Claflins at all with Woodhull?
That I don't know. I don't know about the Belmont Claflins. Possibly. But this Claflin family was from the Midwest. They had they had an itinerant. Mr. Claflin, the father, he was quite a number. He used his two daughters for their clairvoyance, and then promoted them, and basically that's how the family made their money, because they gave seances and basic were
Wow.
yeah.
Right, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. I feel like I just got this huge gift.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to say.
Thank you, Laurie. It was wonderful.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah.
One of the things that I like to, I knew nothing about any of these women. I mean, nothing. I had never even heard of them. And it's kind of my mission to give these talks to let all of you know about them because they're fascinating and it's just it's lovely to have a receptive audience. It's so nice to have people interested. And what other questions do you have about their lives or their influence?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Uh, William Ellery Channing, the transcendentalist, made a distinction between worthiness and respectability. These women struggled with respectability. And sometimes people in the upper classes have a problem with being worthy. It's easy to be worthy, but there's the pull to respectability. Have you, in your long life, encountered any situation where respectability has held you back? We know that a woman's reputation in the 19th century was practically all she had. And this sort of leads into property. Did these women own any property?
Those are kind of two different things, but I'll address
Two questions.
the property. Isabella Beecher Hooker, in her advocacy, Isabella Beecher Hooker worked at the state level, which was actually very smart, and she wrote and advocated for women's property rights, and she and her husband wrote a position that was then accepted so that women could have property rights in the state of Connecticut. Of course, that was also one of the main features of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's advocacy was property rights. And it was of Olympia Brown's, but Olympia Brown was predominantly interested in educational opportunities and giving women the background they needed so they could support themselves, so that they could not only support themselves, but so that they could be who they needed to be. And have choices. She had the choice because she had the good fortune to marry an absolutely extraordinary human being. And, so because they were a partnership, they were absolutely a partner. The respectability part, Olympia Brown was extraordinarily respectable in the conventional sense, but not because because that's who she was, and Isabella was as well. The Victoria Woodhull, on the other hand, was very respectable toward the end of her life. So respectability cuts both ways, because if you look at respectability as conventional, then one would say, oh, at the end of her life she was respectable, right? And I would say that at the end of her life, she was broken because she knew full well what it was that she once was and what it was that she could no longer be.
Thank you.
It's interesting that you mention the spirits, because in Europe, particularly in England, this was quite respectable. Bertrand Russell was really a proponent of this sort of thing that he considered almost scientific.
Really? I didn't realize that, Nicole.
And Madame Blavatsky, you've heard of Madame Blavatsky. Well, she also created some form of even of religion that dealt with that. So in other words, it was not ridiculed in certain places. And also the notion of respectability varies from country to country.
Mhm.
So that's why they were able to go to Europe, I
Yes.
think. And, you know, I love the way you presented everything. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, it was lovely having such a receptive audience. So, it's just lovely to be able to share this with people. And it, um, I think there's so much we can learn from how how we are viewed. There's no question that that's important. And but when you look at, for instance, even someone like Anita Hill, who is certainly not no Victoria Woodhull, and how she was vilified during those hearings and after. And I watched those hearings. I felt that she was such a credible witness, so credible. And I watched the men. And yeah, I mean, I have nothing against men. I think they're wonderful. And I think the feminist movement in the 80s made a big mistake to vilify men. I think that's, first of all, that's not even enlightened. However, these particular men in that committee, led by Joe Biden, who would not even allow Anita Hill's character witnesses to testify. What were they afraid of? Her character witnesses. That's all she wanted. And Biden wouldn't. He cut off the meeting. He cut off the hearings totally, because he was afraid of coming against the first black, a black candidate for the. I said at that point, that's it. I am never voting for this man for anything. I hope he runs for nothing. Whatever he runs for, I will actively work against him. And the
And did you? And did you? No,
so good.
I hope not.
Oh dear. But you know what? I was not a happy voter.
I have a question, in terms of that concept of, what people did then and now. Was curious that I hadn't heard of Woodhull before, so I just did a Wikipedia quickly, on her. And I thought, well, and I was curious to read whether or not it's true, the perspective in the Wikipedia about her views on abortion and eugenics that were in the Wikipedia. That she was against abortion and promoted eugenics, and which I found, sort of interesting, which we, and I thought that was just sort of interesting. And I think that also had to do with the fact I was reading about, she had a child that was disabled, and, she felt that, it would sort of run counter to what I would have thought. So I thought it was interesting how embracing certain things and how views change over time for someone that you want to respect, but people have mixed histories when we review where they were in their time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And she was very devoted to that child. That's one of the most wonderful things about her. And she had good relations with all her past liaisons. It was like one big very unusual family. And there is some evidence that she may have at some point lived a life, been a prostitute, basically. Whether that was never proven, but she's definitely, and that's what makes her interesting. Because there are certain things about her that are just so contradictory, and so and the eugenics being one, when that's not how she lived her life. I don't know. But that I think is just part of what makes her such a fascinating person.
Thanks, Laurie. It was really a great presentation. And I'd love to have that book in our church library. So
The Notorious Victoria or the UU one. You know, Notorious Victoria is actually when as scandalous, I suppose, and controversial as she was, when you look at how other women are portrayed like that, and they are not at all like that. Anita Hill is one. Hillary Clinton was another. Not that she was portrayed as scandalous, but she was strident, she was harsh, she was too outspoken, she wasn't conciliatory enough, she was harsh. You know, these kind of code words.
and wore pants.
Yes, oh, heaven forbid, yes. The bloomer costume rears its head yet once more.
I believe Jean has a question.
Oh, yes.
Laurie, for someone like Olympia Brown, who went to divinity school, am I correct? She came from a family who had the means to provide her funds for her various interests. Is she the one whose husband died early of a stroke? How would she have continued with all of this without some control of the money in the family? How would she have been, would somebody else have been controlling the money that her husband had or that her family was giving her? How would that have worked given the laws of marriage at the time?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I didn't have time. I do a whole talk on Olympia Brown, and then I do another talk just on the Beecher Tilton trial and what that teaches us. I'm so glad you asked because she supported herself through her ministry when she was a minister. With Divinity School, her family did support her. The family was not wealthy; they were homesteaders in Michigan. But they were very supportive of their children and especially of education. So she first went to Antioch, and I mean, her second school was Antioch, and I think that had a very small tuition. How the tuition was paid at the divinity school, that I don't know, but I would think that was probably from her parents as well. However, when she was in Weymouth, she supported herself, and when she was in Bridgeport, she did. And in Bridgeport, she met her husband, and he was actually a very well connected and very successful financially food broker, and was had several outlets in the food business. So it took six attempts to get her to marry him, and finally, with the sixth attempt, he wore her down, and that was what she was concerned about. She was concerned about losing her independence. That
Wow.
she would have to be in the women's sphere because she would. So they had an agreement as Isabella Beecher Hooker and her husband had, that this was what they would do. And interestingly enough, Isabella Beecher had 4 children, 2 or 3 years apart, and Olympia Brown had 2 children, 2 or 3 years apart. So there we are. So so when he married her, then they had that dual income. However, there's a long story with what happened at the Bridgeport Church, and while she was um, on maternity leave, the forces at the church that didn't want a woman minister motiv- mobilized and said, she'd come when the church was in need, and now she'd built the church up, and now it was time for a male minister. And she'd built the church in Bridgeport up to such a point that it was now attractive to a male minister. So when she came back, they said, "Thank you very much and goodbye." And of course, she was devastated. And typical of Olympia Brown, she just was not going to give up. And she finally found this little church in Racine, Wisconsin. They discouraged her more than Ebenezer Fish at the divinity school. Very, very candid. They said, "We would love for you to come. However, we don't want you bringing your family here." And then finding out that we're this chaotic, broken down, dysfunctional organization. And she said, "Oh, well, that sounds like someplace where I could make a contribution." So what does she do? But I don't know if she sends her husband. I think he agrees to go. He says, "No problem. I'm going to Wisconsin. I'll see what it's like. I'll see what if I can start the food business out there. We'll make this happen." So he goes, and then he writes back, and yes, it is every bit as awful as the Board of Trustees has indicated it was. And he said, "I'll have to see what I'll do." But he basically ended his business in Connecticut, which was a very successful business, and grows halfway across the country so that his wife can take this job at this, dysfunctional church that might not even be around. And I mean, oh, that's just such an inspiring story. So back he comes, and they pack up and they go, and Olympia Brown builds that church up so that it's such a powerhouse that speakers from all over the country come to speak in this
Wow.
this cultural center that she starts there, because she wants to contribute to the town of Racine as well. And he decides that he's going to get into the printing business. And he starts a newspaper, or I think he buys an existing newspaper. He buys an existing newspaper and becomes a very prominent newspaper man. In addition,
Wow.
of course, being a Sunday school teacher,
Wow.
was never, he was totally devoted to helping her with the Sunday school. I mean, and then to your point, when he has the stroke, the partners in the business collude to squeeze Olympia Brown out. And she and her son and her daughter work very hard with the help of some lawyers so that she is not squeezed out, and that she, if they sell, that she gets her fair share of that business.
Oh,
Wow. Laurie, who's talking?
I just want to thank you, Laurie, for doing
Yeah.
all this research and bringing it to us in such a concise manner. And the parallels you've drawn with famous women today, I really appreciate it. Just thank you, and best wishes for continuing your very good work with this.
Oh, thank you so
agreed,
much.
agreed.
Thank you, Laurie. It was wonderful.
It was
Fascinating facts. And I think Olympia Brown lived to see women get the right to vote, too.
Yes, she did. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you pointed that out.
Ah,
Oh, I totally forgot that. Yes, she was
That's, great.
cast her vote.
Yeah.
And she was, absolutely. Even in retirement, when she retired to live with her sister in Baltimore, she was, she wasn't the firebrand that Victoria Woodhull was, but in her determined way, she made it very clear that what she stood for, because at her funeral, the newspaper said that she was a force to be reckoned with, all 5 feet of her.
Laurie, this has been wonderful. I think we may have to come to a close, but I think we could go on talking about this for hours.
so too.
And I think we're all inspired to read more about it, too. So thank you so
Wait a
much.
minute, Doris has a question. Doris has a question.
Doris?
Unmute yourself, please, Doris. We
You're
can't hear you.
It's so easy. It'd be helpful if there was some kind of mechanism where you could let people know that they're muted. Because
There is. There's a little red thing.
Right.
really, oh
I
yeah,
have a comment while we're waiting for Doris to unmute.
oh yes, go right ahead.
I was very taken by the Anita Hill. I watched every moment in Congress against Thomas. And I saw the documentary that you mentioned on Henry Louis Gates' program, Finding Your Roots. And I was so glad to find out, which maybe other people don't know, but Anita Hill was a member of the NAACP and they were backing her. And she had the support at the time she was in Congress. And I had assumed she was all alone, but she did have the backing of the NAACP. And so I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and Charles Ogletree, and the lawyer that sat behind her. The white man was a very distinguished constitutional lawyer, and Gates. I mean, the community, not just the Black community, although the Black community was absolutely behind her. She had very powerful people, and those are the very people, because she's much more reserved and diffident, but those people would not let her story die. And with Henry Louis Gates, do you recall when he showed that he opens his program with a vision of the committee, and he shows the committee and he shows Biden, going,
I know, right, right.
Yes. Oh, that's I think Henry Louis Gates is just the best. And what a smart thing for him to do. And that said it all. You're so right. And when those hearings are, this very prominent lawyer, I forget, was it Abrams? I think it was anyway, he was right behind her, and I loved the fact that her family came in. I mean, what a wonderful, so she wasn't alone. Yeah, yeah. Uh, Doris, did you have a comment? Oh,
Mark,
Doris?
Mark, can you unmute her?
Doris,
So
look at the,
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to say, and thanks to Laurie too, but what an inspiration Olympia Brown is and was to women ministers going into the Unitarian Universalist tradition, because they felt that she paved the way, and it gave us all such a sense of a companion who was with us every inch of the way. And thanks, Laurie. And I look forward to your biography. I think it'll be wonderful. And I think we should get that book for our library, don't you?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'll be glad to put in a donation for it.
Oh,
And I'm looking
Thank you,
forward.
Doris.
I'm looking forward
Okay.
to maybe another presentation on a similar topic, because I'm sure you will find other nuggets for us to witness.
I second
Right.
that.
Yeah. Thanks
Thank
again,
you
Laurie.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Oh, Doris, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I have a whole presentation on Olympia Brown, and Pat actually asked me to do that. And I said, well, I'll be glad to do that. But maybe it'd be interesting to see these three women, because of everything that's happened in our national picture. So,
Yeah.
but in my Olympia Brown presentation, I focus that specifically on how she inspired women, not just in the ministry, but just women who saw a vision for themselves beyond the domestic sphere and wanted to realize that. But especially I think she was at the service for Debbie for Phoebe Hannaford in Hingham,
Mm,
and was just so, and she was such a role model for
yes,
you know.
yeah, it's wonderful.
So,
Thank you again, Laurie.
oh,
Very
thank-
much, and I think we're gonna have to close because of the time constraint. But we really enjoyed you, and thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
Thank